Hey everybody, my name is Tom Pettit. I'm glad to be with you. I'm glad to have you with me. Just as a quick introduction, I am Tom Pettit and I own Living Heritage Tours. I take a lot of people out to the sacred church history sites every year. With 2020 shutting everything down, the year 2020 shutting everything down, I haven't been able to do that. So instead, I've been doing these online firesides every Tuesday night. And then I record them and post them to my blog, tomcpettit.com. So there's an archive of these past firesides that I've done. There's also a link near this video that you're looking at. The link says online firesides. You can click on that and see what firesides are coming up, what presentations, topics that I'm doing in the near future. Also, right below this video is a link. It's brand new. I'm kind of excited about it. And the link is Virtual Church History Tours. As I've done a lot of in-person live church history tours, and now I'm able to do it, I've now put it all together so you can watch videos of me at the sites, see all the sites, see the interior of all the buildings and everything that you would see if you were to actually go there, but also hear every story that I tell on a church history tour. It's all there available on videos now, so you can click that link and check that out if you'd like. But with that, tonight I'm talking about Carthage Jail. I do have to do a little disclaimer. A lot of you are logging on to my blog and clicking this video expecting this to be a live presentation. It's not. The reason being is I found out the day that this was scheduled, that morning I found out that I had booked this appointment with you at the same time that my daughter is having her choir concert. So I decided to rearrange things during my day, pre-record this, and now it's up for you to watch. So whenever you're watching this, it is recording and not live, but normally it is, or it always has been at least. But it's Carthage Jail right now, so let's get into it. Carthage Jail, the story, I think, goes way back, long before the saints even arrived in Nauvoo. In fact, in section 6 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord tells Joseph this. He says, "And even if they," meaning his enemies, "do unto you even as they have done unto me, blessed are ye, for ye shall dwell with me in glory." Now, what did they do to the Savior? Well, his enemies killed him. And so he's alluding to the fact that, Joseph, even if they do the same to you, murder, as they did to me, it's going to be okay, because you're going to come to where I am. And then a few years later, Joseph is anguishing in the Liberty Jail. And we get those sections of the Doctrine and Covenants from the Liberty Jail. And he says in section 122, the Lord says to Joseph, "Therefore, hold on thy way, and the priesthood shall remain with thee. For their bounds are set, they cannot pass. Thy days are known, and thy years shall not be numbered less. Therefore, fear not what man can do, for God shall be with you forever and ever." Again, I think another foreshadowing of what was to come. In 1840, 4 years before the martyrdom, Joseph Sr., who was patriarch of the church, says to his son, he gives him a blessing, but it's a conversation as well. Joseph Sr. says to his son, it blesses him with this promise, "You shall even live to finish your work." At which point Joseph cries out, weeping, "Oh, Father, shall I?" "Yes," says his father, "and you shall live to lay out the plan of all the work which God has given you to do." Now, Joseph's time wasn't up. All the work wasn't done, apparently, because he lived another 4 years. The martyrdom would take place at Carthage Jail, June 27, 1844. In that year, March of that year, so about 90 or so days before the martyrdom, Wilford Woodruff describes a meeting in which Joseph gathered the first presidency and quorum of the 12 apostles into the upper room of the Red Brick Store. The Red Brick Store is where a lot of special things happen. The organization of the Relief Society happened there. The first temple endowments. The meeting with prophets and apostles would occur there, as well as other things. In this meeting, Joseph Smith spent the last winter of his life, some 3 or 4 months with the Quorum of the 12, teaching them. It was not merely a few hours ministering to them the ordinances of the gospel, but he spent day after day, week after week, and month after month, teaching them and a few other things of the kingdom of God. I remember the last speech that he ever gave us before his death. Remember, this is March, and then he dies in June. He stood upon his feet some 3 hours. The room was filled as with consuming fire. His face was as clear as amber, and he was clothed upon by the power of God. He laid before us our duty. He laid before us the fullness of the great work of God. And in his remarks to us, he said, I have sealed upon my head every key, every power, every principle of life and salvation that God has ever given to any man who ever lived upon the face of the earth. And these principles and this priesthood and power belong to this great and last dispensation, which the God of heaven has set his hand to establish in the earth. Now, I have sealed upon your heads every key, every power, and every principle, which the Lord has sealed upon my head. I have lived so long up to the present time. I have been in the midst of this people and in the great work and labor of redemption. I have desired to live to see this temple built, but I shall never live it to see it. I shall never live to see it completed, but you will. I roll the burden and responsibility of leading this church from off my shoulders onto yours. Now, round up your shoulders and stand under it like men, for the Lord is going to let me rest for a while. The stage is set. President Oakes, before he was called to be an apostle, here it is, wrote a book called The Carthage Conspiracy. Elder Oakes, when he was just Dallin H. Oakes, sat as judge on the U.S. Supreme Court, the Utah Supreme Court. And during that time of his life, he wrote this book, The Carthage Conspiracy. And for 200 pages, he goes through the legalities surrounding the story I'm going to tell you. And he proves in 200 pages his two-word title, Carthage Conspiracy. Because that's all that it amounted to, was a conspiracy to see that Joseph would die. And here's how it starts. There's a man by the name of John C. Bennett. John C. Bennett, he joined the church and moved to Nauvoo. And he became friends with the prophet Joseph. He became a trusted advisor to the prophet. In fact, he was given an assignment in which his title was assistant to the president of the church. He wasn't a member of the 12, but he was an assistant to the president. And it was intended that he would have that assignment while Sidney Rigdon was recovering from sickness. He wasn't well. And while he was out of commission as a member of the First Presidency, Joseph relied on John C. Bennett to be a trusted advisor. John gained Joseph's trust, and they counseled quite a bit. John had a background that proves that he had a brilliant mind. He founded a university. And then was president, of course, of that university, among many other things inside of business and the arts and everything else that you could put your hands on. He did, and he just had a great mind, and Joseph recognized him for that, and he was able to provide a lot of good counsel to Joseph. Well, Hyrum Smith is on a mission in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He comes across a woman who has a child who claims to be John C. Bennett's wife. Hyrum sends a letter to Joseph and says, I think your buddy John has a family out here in Pittsburgh. Joseph confronts John about it. John denies it. Joseph writes back to Hyrum, you better make sure the facts are straight. Hyrum writes back, oh, this story is true. So Joseph goes back to John and says, you've got a responsibility out in Pennsylvania to a wife and child. And for that, he took back the responsibilities that John had as far as leadership in the church go. Well, that made John C. Bennett very upset. He wanted power in the church. He wanted leadership. He wanted Joseph's place. And so he conspired to overthrow Joseph by going to the extreme of being an apostate, where he would teach against Joseph. He would try to bring members of the church away from the church and away from Joseph. He claimed Joseph to be a fallen prophet. With that apostasy and those actions of apostasy, he was excommunicated. At the same time, there was an individual by the name of Thomas Sharp. Thomas Sharp was running a newspaper in Warsaw, Illinois, about 30 miles to the south of Nauvoo. The newspaper that he was operating down in Warsaw was called the Warsaw Signal. And he used that platform, that opportunity to publish his word and spread it throughout Warsaw to be an antagonist against Joseph and the church. He spread rumors and falsehoods and lies about what was going on up in Nauvoo. So much to the extreme that the citizens of Warsaw ended up hating the citizens of Nauvoo. And they distrusted them, they didn't like them, and they hated them. Thomas Sharp had the citizens of Warsaw exactly where he wanted them. Well, John C. Bennett goes down to Warsaw and teams up with Thomas Sharp. And together, they fan the flames of that raging fire of hatred against Joseph, the church, and the members of the church, and the citizens of Nauvoo. During this time, there was another individual by the name of William Law. William Law was second counselor in the first presidency of the church. He did some things that got him excommunicated. He also conspired against Joseph in hopes of bringing Joseph down and elevating himself to the presidency, or to be president of the church. As second counselor in the presidency, he had quite a voice. And with that voice, he used it to claim that Joseph was a fallen prophet, and in hopes of leading people away from the church. Well, because of that act of apostasy, he was excommunicated. So William Law, along with his brother Wilson Law, head down to Warsaw and team up with John C. Bennett and Thomas Sharp, and the four of them are now going to conspire against Joseph to eventually bring false charges against him, which will send him off to Carthage, where they've got friends in low places that will help bring Joseph to the end of his life. Well, all of this is happening, and these four men, they decide they're going to move their newspaper from Warsaw right into the heart of Nauvoo. They're going to change the name or start a new newspaper company, and this newspaper is going to be called the Nauvoo Expositor. And the Nauvoo Expositor is going to expose, the intent is going to expose Joseph and the church for being things that are in opposite to what Joseph and the church actually are. They're going to lie about him, slander Joseph and the church. And so they come into Nauvoo and they set up their print shop at the end of Mulholland Street. If you've been to Nauvoo, all the people live down in the flats down by the river. Then you've got the hill up to the bluff, and on the bluff is downtown Nauvoo. It's where the temple is, and if you go there today, of course the temple's there along with little gift shops and restaurants and whatnot. If you've been there, if you've been to Annie's Custard, if you've had custard at Annie's, it's that very plot of land where this newspaper was set up. And so now you can see it in your mind. Or if you've never been there, you can at least picture it now in your mind as I've described it. It's important to understand the relationship where the houses were and up the hill and down the road and whatnot for other points in the story. So we'll just get it somewhat clear, but the points of it don't really matter. But we've got the newspaper set up there downtown on Mulholland Street, where Annie's is now, and they print the first edition of the newspaper, and it's slanderous. It's wrong, it's dirty, it's corrupt. There's not a word of truth. It's complete falsehood, and it's all about Joseph and the church and doctrine. And they're trying to rile up the citizens of Nauvoo and members of the church to distrust Joseph, to not like what's going on, and to turn against the prophet. Well, the city council comes together and says, well, we've got a problem on our hands. This newspaper is right. If this printed edition goes out to the citizens, it's going to rile them up, and potentially we're going to have a mob on our hands. That's how bad the language was in the falsehoods that were contained in this edition of the newspaper. Well, the city council gets together to talk about what to do with it, but it was very clear what to do. They were to follow the law, and this was the law. When they established the city of Nauvoo, like any city in America, they had to incorporate it by establishing a charter for the city. So there is a document called the Navu Charter, and essentially it's they used a template used by all the cities throughout America at the time, and they filled in the blanks of who's in charge and what they're going to do and that sort of thing. So Navu Charter is basically a document of all the rules and regulations that they're going to follow, which are just the same as all the other cities throughout America. One of the provisions in that charter says that the city council can determine if a newspaper edition is slanderous or a public nuisance, is the phrase that they use, the public nuisance, which could ultimately lead to a mob and cause a lot of problems. And if they determine that a newspaper is going to potentially cause that public nuisance, then they can take the printed pages and throw them away. legally. Now, that Navu Charter is important to remember because it had to be authorized by the state government. And then once the state government authorized it, it wasn't effective until it was signed by the governor. The governor was Thomas Ford. The Thomas Ford said, yes, this is, along with everything else contained in the Navu Charter, this can happen. The destruction of an edition of the newspaper can happen at the discretion of the city council, and he signs it. Now remember that Thomas Ford, governor, authorized this to be the law, just like it was the law in all the cities and towns throughout America at the time. Remember that name, Thomas Ford, and what I just told you. It'll be handy later in our story as we talk about the conspiracy. So the city council was very slow to push the law because they were nervous that they were just fighting fire with fire. And so they wanted to proceed cautiously. Do we really want to do this? Is there any other way we can proceed without fulfilling the requirements of the law? They spend 10 hours on a Saturday discussing this. They don't come to a conclusion. They take Sunday off, they return on Monday, talk for another 8 to 10 hours. So now we've got 18 to 20 hours of discussion. Should we actually move forward as we legally can, or is there some other way that will be more peaceful? Well, they conclude that the best thing to do is to put this nuisance to bed. And we're going to take the printed pages and we're going to throw them away as we can do. So they called for the constable, John Green. Now, John Green comes to the meeting. He's instructed by the city council to go and destroy the printed pages as he legally can. Now, if you've been to Nauvoo or if you haven't, this meeting is taking place in the upstairs room of the Red Brick Store. I described where the printing press was. It's basically on opposite ends of town. So as big as Nauvoo is, and it's not really big, but as big as it is, John Green's got to walk from one end to the other. I tell you that because as John Green does this, people start noticing, what's the constable doing? Where's he going? What's he doing? People start to get a little curious, and so they start to follow him. By the time they get all the way up there to the printing press, John Green's got about 300 people following him. Now, these 300 people know who's in charge of the newspaper and what they're printing. They're saying bad things about the prophet that they love. And they know that William Law and Thomas Sharp and the rest of them, they're bad guys. So as the sheriff goes in and legally takes those printed pages and walks out the door with him, the 300 guys, they get a little rambunctious. And the rambunctiousness spills into the shop, and the printer gets destroyed. Now, I'll pause here for a moment and tell you two things. I'll remind you one thing and tell you something that might be new info. I'll remind you of what happened in Missouri. W.W. Phelps had a printing press. He was not printing anything slanderous. The mob just didn't like him, and so they broke his press. What happened to the mob? Nothing. Over the course of 20 years prior to this, so from 1824 to 1844, where we are now, 20 years, there had been 20 court cases of this exact same scenario. Somebody going in and breaking up a press. 100%, all 20 cases got thrown out, and no charges were pressed against the individuals who broke up the press. So there's no precedent on this thing. There's only hypocrisy. William Law and Thomas Sharp say, although despite all that, now let's go back to the story. Thomas Sharp and William Law say, we've got him. Let's go to Carthage. We'll file charges against Joseph for destroying our personal property, our press. So that's just what they did. They went and they pressed charges against Joseph. Thomas Sharp did not return to Nauvoo. He's now an enemy in Nauvoo. He goes back to Warsaw and back to his newspaper, the Warsaw Signal. And he writes essentially an advertisement in that newspaper and distributes it among the people in Warsaw. Now remember, John C. Bennett, William Law, Wilson Law, Thomas Sharp, they ignited this hatred in the people of Warsaw against the people of Nauvoo. And this hatred stemmed from the fact that they were fearful that the people in Nauvoo were going to take them over or something. And so they took the anger and the fear and they threw gasoline on that fire by advertising this statement. War and extermination is inevitable! Exclamation point. Citizens, arise, one and all. 3 exclamation points. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Every man will make his own. Then all caps. Let it be made with powder and ball. In other words, boys, get your guns. We're going to Nauvoo. Thomas Ford, the governor of Illinois, gets wind of what's going on. What happened in Nauvoo, what's going on with the advertisement in the newspaper in Warsaw. The Warsaw people are now armed. We've now got the Nauvoo Legion under the direction of Joseph, which is a legal law enforcement agency. And Thomas Ford gets a little fearful. He comes out to Carthage to put a stop to a potential civil war. He's fearful that these 2 groups are going to open fire and massacre each other, a civil war. And so he comes out to Carthage to stop it. On June 22nd, 1844, a notice of a warrant for arrest against Joseph and Hyrum is issued. The sheriff from Carthage comes to issue that warrant and to bring Joseph and Hyrum back to Carthage. Joseph, Hyrum, their friend and fellow apostle, Willard Richards, and Joseph's best friend and bodyguard, Porter Rockwell, the 4 of them get in a boat and they row across the Mississippi. And they realize that what happened in Kirtland is happening again. What happened in Missouri is happening again. They're here, peaceful, loving people, exercising their constitutional rights of land, liberty, peace, happiness, pursuit of happiness, freedom of religion, and the likes, and they're going to be run out of town again. So these 4 men get in the boat, head over to Iowa, across the Mississippi River, with the intent of going as far as the Rocky Mountains to find the next home for the saints. Well, we're getting run out of town again. We're going to go find a place. We'll find the place which God for us prepared, would be their attitude. Of course, it wouldn't be realized until 2 years later when the saints would sing that as they'd walk to Zion. But while they're on the other side, they get a visitor. He comes with a message from Nauvoo, and it's essentially this. Joseph, everybody's talking about how you're running away from the law, that you're hiding out over here in Iowa, and that you're headed to the Rocky Mountains. And some people think you're a coward. And Joseph, we think that you should come back and face the law. You're innocent. So they'll see that you're innocent. They'll send you home. We can continue in our peaceful, loving way of how we like life. And he calls him a coward. And Joseph says this. Joseph knows that if he goes to Carthage, he's a dead man. So he says this. If my life is of no value to my friends, it is of none to myself. In other words, I know I'm going to die. And if you guys are calling me a coward and think I'm chickening out or something, and that I should come home, I'm telling you I'm going to die. And if that's okay with you, then it's no value. My life's no value to you, then it's none to me either. So Hyrum and Willard are getting the boat ready to go back to Nauvoo. Joseph pulls Porter aside. And at this point, it's not prophet and bodyguard. It's boyhood friends, Joseph and Porter, just the 2 of them. They've been through so much already together. And Joseph says to Porter, Porter, what should I do? If I go to Carthage, they're going to kill me. And Porter says this. He says, Joseph, you're the oldest. You know what's best. You make your bed and I'll lie in it. Now, what do those fancy words mean? We don't talk like that anymore. You make your bed, you make your choice, and I'll lie in it. I'll stand by you. Joseph, if you go to Carthage, I'll go with you. If you go to the Rocky Mountains, I'll go with you. If you want to lay down and die right here, I'll lie down and die with you, Joseph. You make the call, I'm with you. The 4 of them get in the boat, and they head back. It's after midnight. And so the next morning, about 6 a.m., the sheriff comes to the mansion house and arrests Joseph and Hyrum. They're headed out of town on June 24th. Now, not only is it Joseph and Hyrum, but it's the whole city council is now under arrest for making the decision to legally destroy the printed paper. It was the uncalled for mob who showed up to destroy the press that Joseph didn't ask for. Joseph's heading down Main Street. He takes a ride on Mulholland, starts to go up the hill to the top of the bluff where the temple is, and he turns around and looks out over the valley where the saints are across the Mississippi. He's right there next to the temple, and as he takes in that view for the last time, he says, "This is the loveliest place and the best people under the heavens. Little do they know the trials that await them. If I do not go there," meaning to Carthage, "the result will be the destruction of this city and its inhabitants. And I cannot think of my dear brothers and sisters and their children suffering the scenes of Missouri again in Nauvoo. No, it is better for your brother Joseph to die for his brothers and sisters. I am willing to die for them." It would take about 9 hours to ride on horseback from Nauvoo to Carthage. And a little bit later on that journey, Joseph would turn to Hyrum and say, "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward all men. If they take my life, I shall die an innocent man, and my blood shall cry from the ground for vengeance. And it shall be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." They were taken to a hotel by the name of the Hamilton House. They were given a room, and the mobs, calling themselves the Carthage Greys, would come outside and they'd cause a commotion, firing their guns into the air, yelling and screaming, knowing that Joseph was inside. Well, the Carthage Greys, let me explain for a quick moment here. The Carthage Greys were nothing but thugs that incited mobs, that were mobs that incited riots. These thugs would create these mobs and as a mob would cause riots and destruction and whatnot, and they were just unlawful, bad, pitiful men. Yet they had some sort of an organization to them. There were about 1,400 of them outside the hotel. 1,400 that were claiming to be Carthage Greys, armed and dangerous. And although they were who I've just described them to be, as I said, they did have some sort of a leadership, and the leadership, or the leader of the Carthage Greys, will come into play in just a moment as part of the conspiracy. Well, this mob is going crazy outside. Who else is there at the Hamilton House Hotel? None other than the governor, Thomas Ford. He opens his bedroom window and calls out to the mob, calms them down by promising, "If you disperse and go home, tomorrow morning come back, and I will parade Joseph and Hyrum through the streets of Carthage. And you'll get your look at him. You can see him then." Next morning, Thomas Ford does just that. He takes Joseph and Hyrum and the others, as they're bound in handcuffs, and parades them like circus animals through the streets of Carthage. Not only did the 1,400 armed members of the Carthage Greys show up, but almost every man, woman, and child in Carthage and all the surrounding area came to see the prophet Joseph being paraded around. It must have been a horrible, horrific scene, as these mobsters, as well as farmers and their families, were there yelling at, cursing at the prophet and the others who were with him, yelling falsehoods at, making threats, and that sort of thing. No violence broke out because Thomas Ford was there with his guards, his troops. He had brought troops with him, a state militia, if you will, and they were there to guard and protect the prisoners so that they could get to their trial without being murdered first by the Carthage Greys. So they get paraded around, and then they go off to their hearing. And the judge, his name is Judge Smith, no relation to the prophet, at least no close relationship. And Judge Smith happens to be, the guy sitting as judge over the hearing, happens to be the leader that I alluded to of the Carthage Greys. The judge is the guy in charge of these 1,400 armed men who want to kill the prophet. So the judge they've all been arrested on cause of rioting. They rioted, and that ended up destroying the press back in Nauvoo. So to the councilman, he would release them with the payment of bail. So bail was made, and the councilman left, bail was made for Joseph and Hyrum, and they were walking out the courthouse. And the judge says, hold on, Joseph and Hyrum, come back. You are now being rearrested for treason. Now, what's the problem with this? Two things. One, their lawyer argues to the judge, you can't arrest them for a new charge. You didn't bring this charge up in the original hearing. Therefore, this is an illegal arrest. President Oakes, in his book, confirms through the legal jargon that is true, that this was an illegal arrest. Not only was it a bogus charge, but the process was illegal. The second problem with the account of treason is that treason was a capital offense, and you can't have bail posted for a capital offense, which means that Judge Smith now had Joseph and Hyrum illegally incarcerated with no legal escape. He would be able to detain them until the Carthage Greys got their hands on him. So, awaiting their trial, they're removed from the Hamilton house to the jail, the Carthage Jail. Now, the Carthage Jail is a 2-story building. It's a small building. And on the main level is what they call a debtor's cell. And there's bars on the windows and on the doors. You get locked in there. The rest of the first floor is made up of a living area and a small kitchen and dining area. And this is where the jailer and his family, his wife and children, would join him in living there in the jail. And so, and then on the second floor, you've got the jailer's bedroom, and right next to the jailer's bedroom is what they call the dungeon. And that's where they put the really bad criminals into a jail cell on the second floor. And it's not so nice and pretty as the jail cell, if it is nice and pretty at all. That's down on the first floor. Joseph and Hyrum were brought into the debtor cell on the first floor. The jailer and his family recognized that Joseph and Hyrum were harmless, and they're probably innocent, is what they're thinking. And they invite him to have dinner with them. Come out of the jail, sit down with my family, sit next to my children, says the jailer, and have dinner. Now, they did charge him. John Taylor had enough money to pay for the dinner, but needless to say, they were out of handcuffs and out of the jail cell and sitting with the family there in the kitchen. Well, there's a lot of ruckus going on outside, and so the jailer says, you know what, I think you'll be safer on the second floor, but I'm not going to put you in the dungeon cell on the second floor. You can have my bedroom. Go into my bedroom, and there you'll be safer there than you will be anywhere else in the jail. So they head upstairs to do just that. In that bedroom, on the 26th of July, the night before the martyrdom, Joseph requests a meeting with Thomas Ford. Thomas Ford comes in, they sit down, they have a conversation. He tells Thomas Ford, he reminds Thomas Ford of the charges that have been levied against him. He explains legally how this doesn't make sense and how they should be dismissed, and how, Governor Ford, you have the legal authority to do that. Governor Ford said, let's have this thing play out, let's go through the court system anyway. Governor Ford, on leaving the room, Joseph pulls it back and he says, I understand you're leaving for Nauvoo tomorrow. If you go to Nauvoo, will you take us with you? Governor Ford says, I'm not sure I'm going to go to Nauvoo, but if I go, I'll take you with me. Why did both of them agree to that? Well, why did Joseph want that and Governor Ford agree to it? Joseph knew that if Governor Ford left with his troops, that there was nothing preventing the Carthage Greys from coming and killing Joseph. Governor Ford knew this as well, and so he made what would turn out to be a hollow promise to Joseph that indeed he would stay with his soldiers, with his troops, in order to protect Joseph. If he didn't stay, then he would take Joseph to keep him under protection. At the very least, he was promising, Joseph, I've got you. I'll protect you through your court hearing. Well, that night, after the governor left and made what I'm going to reveal to you was a blank promise, he's laying there in the bed, and everybody's falling asleep except Dan Jones. Now, Dan Jones, we could spend an hour on Dan Jones' stories. He's awesome. Dan Jones was a faithful friend to the prophet and an amazing missionary member of the church. And he came to be with Joseph. He wasn't under arrest. He didn't have to be there, but he stayed with Joseph because he was loyal to him. But Joseph allowed him to stay because he would utilize Dan Jones as someone who can come and go in order to take messages and receive messages. Well, that would happen on the day of the martyrdom, the next morning on the 27th. But the night of the 26th, Joseph realizes that, there's only one bed in the room, And he realizes that Dan is still awake down there on the floor. So Joseph rolls out of bed. He goes and lays next to his friend Dan Jones. And he throws his arm out like this. So Dan Jones puts his head down and uses Joseph's arm as a pillow. And that's how the prophet of the Restoration spends the last night of his mortal life, caring for the comfort of Dan Jones. They had a little brief conversation. And Joseph whispers to Dan Jones, "Are you afraid to die?" And Dan was a Welshman, and so he used a little bit of English that we're not familiar with. But here's the quote, and you'll understand it still. Joseph whispers to Dan, "Are you afraid to die?" And Dan says, has that time come, think you? Engaged in such a cause, I do not think that death would have many terrors." Joseph would reply, "You will yet see Wales," where Jones was from, "and fulfill the mission appointed you before you die." Now, some say that was Joseph Smith's last prophecy, because Dan Jones, he survived Carthage. He was called as missionary to Wales, and he went there and he baptized thousands of people, bringing thousands of people to the knowledge of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ and helping them get to Zion, where they could be near a prophet, gather with the fellow saints, and receive and enjoy their temple blessings. Soon after this conversation, a group of men storm up the stairs towards the bedroom. It wakes everybody up in the bedroom. And they're all on their feet. They're all on alert. It's the Carthage Greys. And they're wanting to come into the bedroom. But before they do, Willard Richards makes this statement. And I want to read it as he said it because it's beautiful how he starts it. And it's with this. The prophet. So they're under this duress. Bad guys are on the other side of the door. Willard Richards expresses the situation here. The prophet with a prophet's voice. I like that. The prophet with a prophet's voice called out, "Come on, ye assassins, we are ready for you, and would as willingly die now as at daylight." And with that prophet voice, the crowd dispersed. They went down the stairs. Not a word was said for many of the mob members. Well, this concerns Joseph because Thomas Ford's guards are supposedly standing guard outside the bedroom, and the mob was able to get all the way into the jail and up to the door. What's going on here? So Joseph sends, on the morning of the 27th of June, 1844, Joseph sends Dan Jones out to see what's going on because things aren't right. Well, he goes and he talks to a man that he comes across in the street, one of the guards. And the guard says, the guard says, "We have had too much trouble to bring old Joe here to let him ever escape alive. And unless you want to die with him," the guard says to Dan Jones, "you had better leave before sundown. And you'll see that I can prophesy better than old Joe." He's going to go look for Governor Ford to say, "Hey, what's going on?" to see what's happening and to report this unfriendly conversation that he just had. And while he's on his way, he comes across one of Governor Ford's troops. The guy who's there with Governor Ford promised to be there to guard the prophet and the rest of them. And he hears that man who was supposed to be the guard, "Our troops will be discharged this morning in obedience to orders." Now, who gives the orders to him? Governor Ford. So let me repeat that now that we know that the orders are coming from Governor Ford. "Our troops will be discharged this morning in obedience to orders, and for a sham, we will leave the town. But when the governor and the troops have left for Nauvoo this afternoon, we will return and kill those men if we have to tear the jail down." Dan Jones goes to inquire with Thomas Ford, not only about the disturbance the night before, but about these two statements he's just heard. This is how the conversation goes. Dan Jones went to the governor, told him what had occurred in the night, what the officer of the guard had said, and what he had heard while coming to see him, and earnestly solicited him to avert the danger. His Excellency, meaning Thomas Ford, replies, "You are unnecessarily alarmed for the safety of your friends, sir. The people are not that cruel," says the governor. Irritated by such a remark, Jones urged the necessity of placing better men to guard them than professed assassins. Jones remarked, "If you do not do this, I will have but one more desire, that the Almighty will preserve my life to a proper time and place, that I may testify that you have been timely warned of their danger." Jones's life was then threatened by an individual who said, "We are determined to kill Joe and Hyrum, and you had better go away to save yourself." Well, Dan Jones didn't care what he was told about his own life. He went back to warn Joseph. But when he returned to the jail, he had found that Thomas Ford's men had indeed been discharged and replaced by the Carthage Grey. And the Carthage Grey was not letting anybody out, and they were not letting anybody, including Dan Jones, in. Governor Ford left Carthage with his troops and went to Nauvoo. Joseph is left in the hands of murderers, the Carthage Greys. He gets to Nauvoo, and where does he go? The mansion house where Joseph and Emma lived. He's a state dignitary. He's the governor. Emma invites him in, and as she does with other dignitaries, feeds him lunch. Thomas Ford is sitting in the mansion house being fed lunch by Emma Smith after abandoning Joseph and leaving him into the hands of these conspiring murderers. She doesn't know the truth of what's going on. Porter Rockwell had been in the mansion house the night before. Joseph told Porter explicitly, "Do not come to Carthage. I have an important mission for you to fulfill, and it's not in Carthage. Do not go." That's why Porter wasn't there. But he had been in the mansion house the night before, realizing that next morning, the 27th, when Ford was there, that he had left his hat in the front room of the mansion house. He went to the mansion house, let himself in, went to get his hat, and he hears in the adjoining room, the dining room, Thomas Ford speaking to those in his group sitting around the table. Now, Emma wasn't in the room at the time. And Thomas Ford, overheard by Porter Rockwell, says, "The time is at hand, and I'm certain the deed has been done." Porter knew what that scoundrel was talking about. And so he jumped on his horse, and he sped as fast as he could to Carthage. He didn't get there in time. Fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, he didn't get there before Joseph and Hyrum were dead. Let's go back to Carthage. We've now got the Carthage Greys stationed outside the bedroom door, the bedroom where these four men are being held. Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, Willard Richards, member of the 12, John Taylor, member of the 12. They're reading scripture. They're talking about their lives. They're talking about the love that they have for their family and for the saints. Joseph expressing that his only desire is to speak just one more time, to teach the saints in Nauvoo. The day drags on, and it's about 4 o'clock. Joseph asks John to sing a song. John says, "I don't feel much like singing." Hyrum Smith says, "Oh, come on, John. Sing until you have the spirit of singing." So John Taylor starts to sing. He sings a poor wayfaring man of grief. Some of the text of that song is this: "In prison I saw him next condemned to meet a traitor's doom at morn. The tide of lying tongues I stemmed and honored him mid shame and scorn. My friendship's utmost zeal to try, he asked if I for him would die. The flesh was weak, my blood ran chill, but my free spirit cried, I will." And I wonder if those last few stanzas there, those last few words, could have been Joseph's, one of his final testimonies and commitment to the Savior. The flesh was weak, my blood, he asked if I for him would die. The flesh was weak, my blood ran chill, but my free spirit cried, I will. Joseph, from the moment of the first vision to the moment of 5:17 in the afternoon on June 27th, 1844, Joseph always, every time, did the will of the Lord. So at 5:17, the angry mob storms the jail. They come up the stairs. Of course, they hear him coming. They go and they press their bodies, these Joseph and Hyrum, they press against the door to hold it shut as the mob is trying to get through the door. They stick their guns through the slightly ajar door. Willard Richards takes a hickory stick that he uses as a cane, and he starts whacking at the gun barrels, pushing them down, fire at the floor, pushing him up, fire at the ceiling. John Taylor is standing back a little bit, and he's watching what's going on and trying to help where he can. Joseph and Hyrum pushing against the door. One of the gunmen pulls their gun out from the space between that's created from the slightly ajar door, and he pulls it back and now fires directly at the door. Hyrum is faced against the door like this, and the bullet pierces his cheek, and it shoots. He's shot. He falls back onto his back, and as he's falling to the floor, he exclaims, "I am a dead man." Joseph, leaving his post against the door, runs over to Hyrum, falls on his knees, cradles Hyrum's head in his arms, and he starts to weep. And he says, "My dear brother Hyrum." At this point, Joseph knows. And he stands up, and he starts to walk calmly, as it's described by John Taylor and Willard Richards, calmly towards the window. Because he left his post against the door, there's no weight against the door flies open, and the bullets ring out. As Joseph is leaping from the windowsill out the window, in an attempt, what I believe, to save Willard and John, he's struck in the back multiple times. As he's falling, he's struck in the front multiple times. He falls to the ground. The mob leaves the room. They rush down the stairs, out the front door of the jail, and around the corner to where they are now looking over Joseph, just underneath the window that the prophet just fell from, to ensure that the deed had been done and that the prophet was dead. This was leaving Willard and John in the room by themselves. Now, John Taylor, during the commotion, had a similar idea as Joseph, and he was leaping for a window, a different window than Joseph went through. Joseph went out the window directly across the room from the door. John Taylor went out the room right next to, just if you're looking into the room, it's just to the right. The first window on the right is the window that John attempted to jump out of. John was struck several times, in fact 4 times. He had 4 different flesh wounds, and one of those flesh wounds made him so that he couldn't move himself. He was laying on the floor, and when the mob left the bedroom and Willard and John were left alone, Willard went looking for John, who had army crawled underneath the bed to hide. Well, Willard goes over and he grabs John by the ankles and he pulls him out to examine the damage, the potential damage that was done to his friend, not expecting him to be alive. But John Taylor was alive, miraculously. Willard Richards assists John Taylor in moving from the bedroom into the dungeon, the room right next door to the bedroom. And he puts him in the dungeon, and he takes the straw that's all over the floor, and he covers John Taylor's body. And then he takes this dirty old mattress that's also in the dungeon, and he lays it down on top of John. John would live, of course, becoming the 3rd president of the church and testator of the martyrdom. John Taylor would later speculate, most likely correctly, that the way that Willard Richards hit him with that straw pressed up against his wounds and then a heavy mattress pressing against the straw and his body, that slowed the flow of the blood and it preserved his life. Maybe Willard Richards knew what he was doing. He was a physician, after all. Willard Richards would later testify that of all the bullets flying through the room, only one nicked his ear. He didn't have any flesh wounds. In fact, there was no bullet holes even in his clothes. Willard Richards stood about 5 feet 4 inches, a very short man, and he was about 300 feet. He was 300 pounds. So we got a lot of mass in a small area because he's so short and 300 pounds. So there's a big mass of man in the bedroom, and miraculously he didn't get hit by a bullet. Well, it was due to a prophecy that Joseph had given Willard years earlier. And Joseph prophesied that Willard would stand with balls hailing, balls meaning bullets, hailing all around. And he would see friends fall to the left and to the right, and yet none of the bullets would harm or even touch Willard Richards. Prophecy fulfilled. Samuel Smith would arrive on the scene a very short time after everything that I just described happened. Through the difficulty of the ride to Carthage, the agony of being there, preparing the bodies, moving the bodies back under the duress of these surrounding mobs, through it all, Samuel Smith contracted pneumonia. And he would die July 30th of that same year. So about 45 days or whatever between the martyrdom and Samuel Smith's death, Mother Smith would bury 3 sons. The bodies were brought back to Nauvoo and prepared for a public viewing, which would be held in the mansion house in the front room parlor. Of the thousands of people that came through the mansion house to pay their final respects, 2 were Mary Fielding Smith, the now widow of Hyrum, and his son, Joseph F. Smith, who would become the president of the church one day. They enter into the parlor room, and Mary Fielding lifts her little boy, Joseph F., up high enough to see into the casket of his dead uncle. They then would move down and see to where Hyrum was laying, and she again would pick Joseph up so that he could peer. He's about 6 years old at the time, so that he could peer into the lifeless face of his father. While he's peering at his father, who's just been murdered, his mother whispers into that young boy's ear, "Your father died for the truth. Make sure you always live for the truth." Joseph F. Smith lived to his potential. He followed the instruction from his mother, and he always lived for the truth. Instruction that is just as applicable to every Latter-day Saint today, as we should follow that counsel from the widow of Hyrum, Mary Fielding Smith, and live every day for the truth. Here's a quote from Elder Holland. "As one of 1,000 elements of my testimony of the divinity of the Book of Mormon, I submit this as yet one more evidence of its truthfulness. In this their greatest and last hour of need, I ask you," meaning Joseph and Hyrum at Carthage, "in this their greatest and last hour of need, I ask you, would these men blaspheme before God by continuing to fix their lives, their honor, and their own search for eternal salvation on a book, and by implication a church and a ministry that they had fictitiously created out of whole cloth? Never mind that their wives were about to be widows and their children fatherless. Never mind that their little band of followers will yet be homeless, friendless, and houseless, and that their children will leave footprints of blood across frozen rivers and an untamed prairie floor. Never mind that legions will die and other legions live, declaring in the 4 corners of this earth that they know the Book of Mormon and the church which espouses it to be true. Disregard all of that and tell me whether in this hour of death these 2 men would enter into the presence of their eternal judge, quoting from and finding solace in a book, which if not the very word of God, would brand them as impostors and charlatans until the end of time. They would not do that. They were willing to die rather than deny the divine origin and the eternal truthfulness of the Book of Mormon." I'll leave you with one final quote. This is from a man who was not a member of the church. His name is Josiah Quincy, prominent New England citizen, later became the mayor of Boston, Massachusetts. 2 months before the martyrdom, Josiah Quincy had the opportunity to meet Joseph. Many years later, near the end of his life, Josiah Quincy would write down as a journal, as a memoir, of some of the most impressive moments of his life. Meeting Joseph was one of those times. And he writes this, these are his words: "It is by no means improbable that some future textbook for the use of generations yet unborn will contain a question something like this: what historical American of the 19th century has exerted the most powerful influence upon the destinies of our countrymen? And it is by no means impossible that the answer to that interrogatory may be thus written: Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. Millions shall know Brother Joseph again. And just as millions shall know Brother Joseph again, millions have testified of Joseph being prophet, seer, and revelator, standing at the head of this last great dispensation, having restored in full the Church of Jesus Christ. I stand as one of those millions who testify that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. I'll conclude where I started. If you'd like to know about future online firesides, you can click the button just above the video and see that. If you're interested in seeing the virtual church history tour videos, you can click that button just below this video. Anyway, it was great to be with you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and have a wonderful day.